Blood had frozen on the stone floor of the amphitheater, marking the exact spot where Sutton Pierce's knees had buckled under the weight of her alpha's command. Banished, stripped of her rank, sentenced to die in the unforgiving wilderness by the very man she had tried to save. Griffin Lowell called her a hysterical traitor. His inner circle branded her a saboteur. But as the first unnatural flakes of razor-sharp snow began to fall, dropping the temperature 40 degrees in a single hour, their arrogant laughter would turn to desperate screams. They threw her out to silence her warnings. Now they were going to have to crawl through frozen hell to survive. And Sutton Pierce, the woman they condemned to death, was the only one who knew how. But that reckoning was still 96 hours away. Sutton pressed her bare palm against the frozen bark of a 280-year-old lodgepole pine, her breath forming thick clouds in the November air. To the human eye, the deep wilderness of Montana's Bitterroot Range looked exactly as it should in late autumn, crisp, sharp, and quietly settling into winter's embrace. The mountains wore their first dusting of snow, like a warning, and the sky hung heavy with the promise of more. But Sutton Pierce wasn't human, and she wasn't relying on instinct alone. As the lead environmental surveyor for Stonehaven Corporation, a multi-billion-dollar timber and real estate conglomerate that served as a front for one of the most powerful werewolf packs in the Northern Rockies, Sutton relied on data. Hard, unforgiving, irrefutable data. And right now, every single measurement she was recording screamed the same message: catastrophe was coming, and it was coming fast. She pulled the weatherproof tablet from her canvas field jacket, fingers moving quickly despite the biting cold. The barometric pressure readings made her stomach drop. 0.38 inches of mercury per hour. Dropping. That kind of rate didn't happen outside of theoretical models and disaster simulations. The jet stream wasn't just shifting, it was collapsing entirely, creating a vacuum that would suck Arctic air down from the polar vortex like water circling a drain. The mountain goat herds had descended 4,800 vertical feet in the last 96 hours, abandoning their high-altitude grazing grounds in a panicked exodus. Entire populations moving as one, driven by an instinct older than conscious thought. They always knew first. Always. The ravens had abandoned the territory 19 days ago. Not a single black wing against the gray sky. Not a single harsh call echoing through the pines. In 40 years of pack records, the ravens had never left early. Never. Even the trees knew. Sutton could feel it in the sap beneath her palm, viscous and slow retreating deep into the roots, as if the lodgepole pine itself was bracing for the apocalypse. The whitebark pines higher up the mountain had already entered a state of dormancy, so profound that their needles had taken on an almost crystalline quality, as if the trees were turning themselves to stone. And the grizzlies. God, the grizzlies! Their dens this year had been excavated 8.1 feet deeper than the 40-year average. She had measured them herself, crawling into the dark earth with nothing but a headlamp and a measuring tape counting the claw marks in the frozen soil. The bears were digging down to bedrock, seeking a depth that would protect them from a cold so profound that even hibernation might not be enough. Wendigo Winter. The words slipped out before she could stop them, hanging in the frozen air like a curse. It was the old pack term, the one the elders whispered about, but the corporate wolves dismissed as folklore. A superfreeze, a meteorological anomaly that occurred once every 200 to 300 years, bringing temperatures so low that even shifting into wolf form wouldn't save you. The cold would crystallize the fluid in your lungs in minutes, turning breath into ice, turning life into death. The last Wendigo Winter had been in 1823. It had killed 87% of the Yellowstone pack. Before that, 1647. The Blackfeet territory had been completely erased, every wolf frozen solid in their dens, entire bloodlines extinguished in a single week. Sutton turned and began running back toward the Stonehaven compound, her boots crunching through the early snow. Her wolf stirred beneath her skin, restless and anxious, sensing her fear. She pushed it down. There would be time for shifting later if they survived. Right now, she needed her human hands and her human mind. The compound came into view as she crested the final ridge, a sprawling complex of glass, steel, and carefully preserved historic stone nestled in the valley like a crown. Stonehaven Corporation's headquarters. $300 million of architectural ambition designed to project power and permanence. Griffin Lowell's monument to himself. Tonight was the quarterly board meeting, which meant it was also a pack council gathering. Every wolf of significance would be there dressed in $1,000 suits and designer gowns, discussing expansion strategies and profit margins, while the world outside prepared to kill them all. Alpha King Griffin Lowell would be presiding over his empire as always. And Sutton was going to walk into that boardroom and tell him that his empire was about to be buried under 10 feet of ice. The heated marble floors of the executive boardroom were a stark contrast to the death creeping toward them from the north. Sutton stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the scene: the 30-foot oak conference table, the wall of monitors displaying financial projections and acquisition targets, the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the valley below. Griffin Lowell sat at the head of the table, looking every inch the modern Alpha King. His tailor-made charcoal suit barely contained the raw predatory muscle beneath, and his steel-gray eyes held the sharp calculation of a man who had turned a regional timber operation into a $3.8 billion empire in less than a decade. His dark hair was cut with precision, his jaw was hard, and his presence filled the room like a physical force. Beside him sat Morgana Drake. Morgana was Stonehaven's head of strategic development, and more dangerously, the woman Griffin had recently chosen to be his Luna. She was striking in a way that seemed almost manufactured platinum blonde hair that caught the light like spun glass, ice blue eyes that never quite smiled even when her mouth did, and a body wrapped in a $5,000 power suit that screamed corporate predator. She had joined the pack 5 years ago when her family's failing operation had been absorbed into Stonehaven's growing empire, and she had climbed the ranks with ruthless efficiency. Sutton had always known that Morgana hated her. It was in the way Morgana's eyes tracked her movements during pack gatherings, in the slight curl of her lip whenever Sutton spoke about traditional pack wisdom or environmental concerns. To Morgana, Sutton represented everything she despised: a purist who valued survival over stock prices. A woman who had Griffin's ear on matters that Morgana couldn't control, a competent threat that couldn't be eliminated through corporate maneuvering. What Sutton didn't know yet was that Morgana Drake had been selling Stonehaven's secrets to the Obsidian Syndicate for the past 18 months, and that she had just received final payment $20 million and a guaranteed executive position once Stonehaven's territory was carved up and sold to the highest bidder. The Syndicate needed the pack to be vulnerable, destabilized, weak. They needed the Alpha distracted and the pack's defenses compromised. And they needed Sutton Pierce silenced before she could warn anyone about what was coming. But Sutton didn't know any of that as she stepped into the boardroom, her field jacket still covered in pine needles and dirt, her boots leaving small puddles of melted snow on the pristine marble. She only knew that she had 6 days, maybe 7, to convince these people to take action before the Wendigo Winter erased them all. Griffin looked up from the acquisition spreadsheet he'd been studying, and for just a moment, Sutton saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Concern, maybe. Or recognition. He knew she wasn't prone to dramatics. In the 3 years since he'd hired her to handle environmental compliance and territorial surveys, she had never once burst into a board meeting unannounced. But then Morgana placed a perfectly manicured hand on Griffin's arm, and his expression hardened. Sutton, Griffin sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose in a gesture of infinite patience worn thin. We are in the middle of finalizing the Riverbend acquisition. The signing is in 5 days. What is so urgent that you felt the need to bypass security and interrupt this meeting? Sutton didn't waste time with preamble. She crossed to the conference table and slammed her tablet down in the center, her fingers flying across the screen to project her findings onto the main display. Weather models bloomed across the wall-sized monitor satellite imagery, showing a massive low-pressure system forming over the Rockies like a bruise spreading across the sky. The territory won't matter if there's no one left alive to hold it, Sutton said, her voice cutting through the sudden silence. Griffin, look at the data. The jet stream is collapsing. The Pacific currents have stalled. Within 6 days, we're going to be hit by a superstorm that will make every winter on a record look like a spring morning. Vaughn crossed the pack's head of security, and a man built like a brick wall wrapped in tactical gear scoffed from his position near the door. It's winter in Montana Pierce. It snows. We have central heating and fur. What's the crisis? This isn't just snow, Vaughn. Sutton's hands were shaking now, whether from cold or adrenaline or pure frustration, she couldn't tell. This is a sub-zero anomaly. The old texts call it a Wendigo Winter. Temperatures will drop to 48 degrees below zero. The power grids will fail. The supply roads will be buried under 12 feet of ice. Our current winter reserves are at 41% because we liquidated the surplus to fund Morgana's new regional headquarters in Bozeman. She turned to face Griffin, directly ignoring everyone else in the room. If we don't start emergency rationing and activate bunker protocols right now, our pups and elders will freeze to death in the dark. This isn't a projection. This isn't a worst-case scenario. This is happening. The animals know it. The earth knows it. We need to act. A heavy silence fell over the boardroom. For a fraction of a second, Griffin actually looked at the screen, his eyes scanning the data with the sharp intelligence that had made him a billionaire before 40. The satellite imagery was undeniable. A massive Arctic vortex descending from the North Ocean currents, stalling along the Pacific coast, atmospheric pressure dropping at rates that defied historical precedent. He knew Sutton wasn't prone to exaggeration. She was the one who had predicted the wildfire season of 2022 with 94% accuracy, who had found the Los Reyes twins in 2021 when every other tracker had given up, who had warned about the landslide risk on the Western Ridge 3 months before it happened. She was the best surveyor Stonehaven had, maybe the best in the entire Northern Rockies. But then Morgana leaned in, her voice dropping to a tone of gentle, condescending concern that somehow managed to fill the entire room. Sutton, darling, Morgana purred, each word dripping with false sympathy. You've been out in the field for, 9 days straight? When was the last time you actually slept in a bed? We have 6 meteorologists on the corporate payroll, all of them with PhDs from major universities, and not a single one of them is predicting anything close to an apocalypse. What we're seeing is seasonal variance well within normal parameters for a Montana winter. One of the investment bankers at the table, a human in an $8,000 suit who handled Stonehaven's external financing, cleared his throat. If we halt the Riverbend acquisition over weather speculation, we forfeit a $50 million deposit. The shareholders will crucify us. Morgana's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on Griffin's arm, a gesture of intimate concern that Sutton wanted to rip away like the manipulation it was. Sutton is dedicated to her work, and we all value her expertise, but she's also clearly exhausted. She's reading catastrophe into normal data patterns because she's been isolated in the wilderness for over a week. What we need to do is increase our heating capacity by, say, 25%, maybe order some backup generators for critical facilities. But locking 438 people in underground bunkers and destroying a $720 million deal because of bird migrations and bear dens, that's not leadership. That's panic. The room murmured agreement. Sutton could see it happening, could feel the moment slipping away from her like water through her fingers. They weren't looking at the data anymore. They were looking at her mud-stained, exhausted, wild-eyed. She looked like someone who had been in the woods too long, someone who had lost perspective. And Morgana, polished and perfect and utterly in control, looked like the voice of reason. Enough, Griffin's voice didn't just fill the room, it detonated in it. The word carried the weight of the Alpha Command, that primal, irresistible force that turned a simple directive into a compulsion written into the bones of every wolf who heard it. Sutton felt it slam into her like a physical blow, her knees buckling involuntarily, her chin forced down in a gesture of submission, so automatic that her conscious mind didn't even register the movement until it was done. Every wolf in the room felt it. Even the human investment bankers seemed to sense something, their faces paling slightly, their bodies shifting backward in their chairs as if pushed by an invisible hand. Griffin stood, his full height and presence towering over the table. I will not halt a generational expansion over folklore and wildlife observation. We are not primitive wolves cowering in caves anymore. We're a Fortune 500 corporation. We have redundancies. We have infrastructure. We have contingency plans for every scenario. He turned his gaze fully on Sutton, and she saw the alpha in him now. Not the businessman, the wolf that his father had been, the lineage of power that stretched back generations. Increase heating capacity by 25% across all facilities. Order backup generators for the medical center, the nursery, and the elder housing. Double-check our diesel fuel reserves. That is my final decision. Sutton struggled against the Alpha Command, her wolf whining inside her chest, desperate to submit, to accept, to stop fighting. But she forced her eyes up, forced herself to meet Griffin's gaze, even as every instinct screamed at her to look away. Griffin, please, she managed, her voice strained. The last Wendigo Winter killed? You're dismissed, Ms. Pierce. The formality of it was worse than the command. Ms. Pierce, not Sutton. Not the woman who had saved his territory from wildfire, who had found lost pack members, who had bled for Stonehaven for 3 years. Take 3 days of personal leave. You're clearly burnt out. We'll discuss your concerns when you're rested and thinking clearly. 16 pairs of eyes watched her retreat from the boardroom. Sutton felt every one of them like a blade between her shoulder blades. Morgana's cold smile, Vaughn's dismissive smirk, the investment banker's barely concealed relief, and Griffin's implacable absolute certainty that he was right and she was wrong. As the heavy oak door closed behind her, she heard one of the bankers laugh. Drama queen much. The sound of their resumed conversation, already moving past her warning as if it had never happened, followed her down the marble hallway like a ghost. Sutton's cabin sat on the eastern edge of Stonehaven's territory, a small log structure that had been built 70 years ago as a ranger station before the pack acquired the land. It was isolated, quiet, and exactly the kind of place Sutton had always preferred, close enough to the compound to fulfill her duties, far enough away to breathe. She sat on the porch now, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. The temperature had already dropped another 4 degrees since the board meeting 2 hours ago, 28 degrees Fahrenheit and falling. The sky was the color of a bruised purple-gray and swollen with pressure. Inside the cabin, on the mantel above the fireplace, sat a photograph in a simple wooden frame. 2 teenagers' arms slung around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera with the kind of unself-conscious joy that only comes before the world teaches you to be afraid. Sutton at 16, her dark auburn hair wild and her eyes bright. And beside her, her younger brother Cole, 14 years old, and convinced he was invincible. Cole had died in an avalanche in the winter of 2019. Sutton had predicted it 3 days before it happened. She had studied the snowpack, measured the temperature gradients, calculated the stress loads on the slope above the popular backcountry skiing area. She had filed a report with the Park Service, had posted warnings on every outdoor recreation forum she could find, had even called the local news station. No one had listened. The snow looked fine to them. The weather was beautiful. She was being paranoid. Cole had been one of 7 people buried when the entire slope let go 250,000 tons of snow, moving at 80 miles per hour. They found his body 4 days later, frozen solid, his eyes still open. Sutton had stopped trusting other people's judgment after that. She had stopped waiting for someone else to take action. She had stopped believing that being right would be enough to save anyone. Never again, she whispered to the photograph, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. I won't let it happen again, Cole. I swear. She pulled out her personal credit card and opened her laptop. If the pack wouldn't prepare, she would. She had $54,000 in savings, the accumulated earnings of 3 years of careful budgeting, and a lifestyle that consisted mostly of work and solitude. She had been saving it for something important, though she had never been quite sure what. Now she knew. She began to order supplies. Not corporate purchase orders that would go through Stonehaven's accounting department and trigger alerts in Morgana's office. Personal purchases charged to her own card, shipped to a remote hunting lodge 15 miles into the backcountry that the pack used maybe twice a year during elk season. Somewhere off the grid, somewhere Morgana wouldn't be watching. 240 Mountain House freeze-dried meals, 4 Champion 7,500-watt portable generators, 50 Sol emergency bivy bags, industrial medical supplies, quick clot thermal blankets, IV fluids, antibiotics, 15 Mister. Heater Big Buddy propane units in 30 20-pound propane tanks. Cold weather gear rated for temperatures down to 60 below zero. The total came to $52,843. Her savings account balance dropped to $1,157. Everything she had worked for gone in 40 minutes of frantic online ordering. But if she was right, it would save lives. And if she was wrong, well, she would be broke and embarrassed, but at least she could live with that. She had lived with worse. The next 4 days passed in a blur of covert activity that would have made a Cold War operative proud. Sutton worked during the day, filing routine reports and conducting standard territorial surveys as if nothing had changed. But at night, she shifted into her wolf form and ran 15 miles into the backcountry, hauling supplies to the remote hunting lodge in loads that would have broken a human's back. Her wolf was built for endurance rather than speed, lean, and rust-colored, with the kind of stamina that could maintain a ground-eating lope for hours without rest. She made the round trip 3 times each night, her paws silent on the frozen ground, her breath steaming in the increasingly frigid air. She organized the supplies with military precision, heating equipment in one corner, food and water in another, medical supplies in a third, emergency shelter materials in a fourth. She labeled everything, created inventory lists, wrote detailed instructions for rationing and resource management. If she had to bring survivors here, if the worst happened and the compound became uninhabitable, she wanted to be ready. On the 3rd night, as she was hauling the last load of propane tanks, she encountered Elder Thaddeus in the forest. Thaddeus was 78 years old, the oldest wolf in Stonehaven, in the pack's unofficial historian. His human form was stooped and weathered, his hair completely white, but his eyes were sharp and clear. He had been born in 1946 when Stonehaven was still a collection of wolves who lived in the old ways, before the corporate transformation, before the suits and the stock options and the billion-dollar acquisitions. He stood in a clearing wrapped in a heavy coat that had probably been old when Sutton was born, watching her with an expression of profound sadness. "You're preparing for the frost that eats wolves, aren't you?" he asked, his voice rough with age and something that might have been grief. Sutton shifted back to human form, not caring that she was naked in the freezing air. Modesty was a luxury wolves couldn't afford. "You believe me. My grandmother survived the 1823 freeze," Thaddeus said quietly. "She was 6 years old. She told me the stories before she died, the sky turning purple, the trees screaming as they split apart. The wolves who tried to run south and were found miles later, frozen solid mid-stride, their eyes turned to ice." He looked up at the bruised sky. "I know the signs. Griffin is a fool. His father was a fool. They think money and concrete can protect them from the earth's fury." He reached out and gripped Sutton's hand with surprising strength. His skin was like dry paper, but his grip was firm. "You save who you can, child. That's all anyone can ask." Thaddeus pulled something from his coat pocket, a piece of aged leather folded and creased with decades of handling. He unfolded it carefully, revealing a hand-drawn map, the ink faded but still legible. "Geothermal caves in the Deadlands, the Forbidden Zone. My grandfather mapped them in 1903. If you're cast out, if they exile you for this, you go there. The volcanic vents keep the interior above freezing even when the world outside is frozen solid. You understand?" Sutton stared at the map, her throat tight. The Deadlands were a treacherous stretch of mountains at the very edge of Stonehaven's territory, a place where even experienced wolves didn't venture. Unstable scree slopes, hidden crevasses, no shelter, no water, no game. It was where the pack dumped rogues when they wanted them to die slowly. "You think they'll exile me?" she whispered. Thaddeus's eyes were infinitely sad. "I think Morgana Drake will do whatever it takes to protect her secrets. And I think Griffin loves his empire more than he loves his people." He pressed the map into her hands. "Hide this. Memorize it. And if the worst happens, you run. You run fast, and you run far, and you survive. Someone has to survive to remember what we were." He turned and walked back into the darkness, leaving Sutton standing alone in the clearing with a map to her own potential grave clutched in her trembling hands. On the evening of the 4th day at 11:47 p.m., the alarms began to scream. Sutton jolted awake in her cabin, her wolf senses screaming danger before her conscious mind even registered the sound. She was running before she fully understood where she was going, her bare feet pounding across the frozen ground, her heart hammering in her chest. The Eastern Warehouse District was half a mile from her cabin. She could smell it before she saw it, ammonia sharp and choking mixed with the copper tang of destroyed meat and the acrid stench of chemical fire. When she crested the ridge and saw the devastation below her, blood turned to ice that had nothing to do with the temperature. Stonehaven's primary cold storage facility had been destroyed. The heavy steel doors had been blown off their hinges, twisted metal hanging at grotesque angles. Inside, the massive industrial freezers had been breached, their contents flooding out in a toxic river. 12,000 pounds of elk venison and beef, 60% of the pack's winter protein reserves, lay in spreading pools drenched in industrial-grade ammonia. The chemical smell was so strong that even from 100 yards away, Sutton's sensitive nose burned. Wolves were pouring out of the compound, now drawn by the alarms and the chaos. Vaughn Cross stood in the center of the devastation, his tactical vest covered in white chemical residue, his face illuminated by the harsh emergency lighting. In his gloved hand, he held a twisted piece of metal. When he saw Sutton approaching, his expression shifted into something cold and victorious. "Well, well," Vaughn called out, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "Look who shows up at the scene of the crime." He held up the device, turning it so the emergency lights caught the engraved serial number on the casing. Sutton's stomach dropped as she recognized it, a custom thermal breaching charge, the kind used for controlled avalanche demolition, the kind she had purchased 2 years ago for her work in the high passes. The serial number was clearly visible, even from 20 feet away, S-Pierce-2019-AVL. "I didn't do this," Sutton said, her voice cutting through the murmuring crowd. She took a step forward, but Vaughn's enforcers moved to block her path. "Someone took my equipment. Someone is trying to frame you." Morgana's voice cut through the night like a blade wrapped in silk. She emerged from the shadows wrapped in white fur, her expression a masterpiece of calculated shock. Griffin walked beside her, his face carved from granite, his eyes burning with a fury that made the air around him seem to shimmer. Morgana pressed one hand to her chest in a gesture of heartbroken disbelief. "Sutton, how could you? We all know you were furious when Griffin dismissed your weather hysteria 4 days ago. You've been purchasing thousands of dollars of survival supplies behind the pack's back, hoarding them in the backcountry like some kind of doomsday prepper. And now this," she gestured at the destroyed freezers with a trembling hand. "You engineered this crisis to prove yourself right. You sabotaged our food reserves so you could swoop in like a savior with your secret supply stash. You wanted to undermine Griffin's authority, to make him look like a fool, to force him to acknowledge you." The accusation hung in the frozen air like poison. Sutton could see the pack members looking at each other, could feel the shift in the crowd. Morgana's words had the ring of plausibility to wolves who didn't know the full picture, who hadn't been paying attention to the subtle manipulation over the past months. "That's insane," Sutton said, but her voice sounded weak even to her own ears. "Why would I poison our own food supply when I've been warning about a freeze? That's completely contradictory." Griffin stepped forward, and the crowd fell silent. He held the detonator in his massive hand, his knuckles white with the force of his grip. "This has your serial number on it, Sutton, your purchase records, your equipment." His voice was shaking with rage, with betrayal, with something that might have been grief if there had been any room for it past the fury. "You've been hoarding resources in direct violation of my orders. You've been acting against pack interests. And now you've destroyed our winter reserves just to manufacture the emergency you predicted." "She planted it," Sutton pointed at Morgana, desperation making her reckless. "She's been working with the Obsidian Syndicate. She's selling out the territory. I've seen the encrypted communications, the secret meetings. Do not insult my mate with baseless conspiracy theories." The snarl that came out of Griffin's mouth was barely human. The sound vibrated in Sutton's teeth, in her bones, and the marrow of her skeleton. And then his hand was moving faster than thought, the back of his hand connecting with her face with a crack that echoed off the warehouse walls. Sutton crashed to the concrete, her lips split blood-hot against the freezing ground. The taste of copper flooded her mouth. The world spun, tilted, reformed itself into a reality where her alpha had just struck her in front of the entire pack. Where the man she had served for 3 years, the leader she had tried to save, had just publicly brutalized her. The crowd gasped. Even Morgana looked momentarily shocked, though Sutton could have sworn she saw satisfaction flicker in those ice-blue eyes before the perfect mask of concern slid back into place. "You have crossed the line from insubordination to treason." Griffin said, his voice cold, now empty of everything except judgment. "Seize her." Foreign forces grabbed Sutton before she could even think about running. Silver-laced cuffs snapped around her wrists, and the burn was immediate and agonizing. Silver didn't just hurt werewolves, it suppressed their healing, weakened their strength, made them vulnerable in ways that went beyond the physical. Within seconds, blisters were forming on her skin, the acrid smell of burning flesh adding to the chemical stench that already saturated the air. Griffin's voice rang out across the assembled pack. "The tribunal will convene at dawn. Prepare the amphitheater." The ancient stone amphitheater behind Stonehaven's headquarters had been built 140 years ago, carved into the mountainside by wolves who understood the weight of ritual and the necessity of witness. It was where the pack gathered for ceremonies, for judgments, for the moments that defined who they were as a people. As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of purple and gray that matched the bruise spreading across Sutton's cheek, 438 wolves assembled in the stone seats. The temperature had dropped another 6 degrees overnight, 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Sutton's breath formed clouds as she knelt in the center of the stone circle, her wrists still bound in the silver cuffs that had burned through the top layer of her skin during the long night. She had been held in a concrete cell beneath the compound, allowed no contact with anyone except the guards who brought her water. She couldn't drink because her hands were bound, and food she couldn't eat because her stomach was twisted in knots of fear and rage. They had left her in her blood-stained clothes, had done nothing to clean the split in her lip or the swelling around her eye. Now, as the first light touched the amphitheater, she looked up at the faces surrounding her. These were her people, or they had been. Vivienne Caldwell sat in the third row, her arms wrapped around her 8-year-old daughter, Ember. In 2021, Sutton had pulled Ember from the river when the girl had fallen through thin ice during an unauthorized skating expedition. Sutton had nearly drowned herself in the process, had spent 3 days recovering from hypothermia. Vivienne had cried and called her a hero and sworn eternal gratitude. Now Vivienne's face was hard and closed her eyes, looking anywhere except at Sutton. Elder Thaddeus sat in the back row, tears streaming down his weathered face in silence. He was the only one crying. The only one who seemed to understand what was really happening here. Dashiell, 17 years old and one of Sutton's tracking students, sat near the front with his parents. She had taught him to read animal signs, to understand the language of the forest, to move through the wilderness with confidence. He looked confused, betrayed, as if he couldn't reconcile the woman who had patiently corrected his stance and praised his progress with the traitor kneeling in silver chains. Griffin stood on the raised stone platform that served as the judgment seat, Morgana beside him, in a position that was both supportive mate and co-ruler. The Luna's face was a masterpiece of distressed concern, her eyes slightly red and as if she had been crying, her hand clutching Griffin's arm as if she needed his strength. Sutton Pierce, Griffin's voice echoed off the ancient stone carrying the weight of generations. You stand accused of high treason against the Stonehaven Pack. You are accused of sabotage of our winter food reserves. You are accused of conspiracy to endanger 438 lives through the destruction of critical infrastructure. The evidence against you is irrefutable. Your own equipment was used in the attack. Financial records show you have been illicitly purchasing and hoarding survival supplies while attempting to incite mass panic with apocalyptic predictions. Sutton forced herself to her feet, ignoring the burning agony in her wrists, ignoring the way her vision swam from dehydration and exhaustion. I bought that equipment to save your lives, she shouted, her voice cracking. Look at the sky, Griffin. Look at it. The clouds are the color of a bruise. The temperature has dropped 24 degrees in less than 96 hours. This is textbook Wendigo Winter progression, and you're prosecuting me while the executioner is standing at our gates. She could feel it building in him, that terrible pressure that preceded the Alpha Command. She fought against it, knowing it was useless, knowing that her wolf would submit even if her human mind refused. Look at the data, she screamed. Just look at the silence. The command didn't just force her to stop talking. It drove her to her knees with a violence that cracked stone, the gravel biting into her flesh through her torn pants. Her jaw clamped shut so hard she felt a tooth crack. Every muscle in her body locked into place, frozen in a tableau of submission so absolute that she couldn't even blink. The Alpha Command was supposed to be used to protect the pack, to stop fights before they turned deadly, to override panic in moments of crisis. It was a sacred trust, a responsibility that Alpha swore to use only for the good of their people. Griffin was using it to silence a woman trying to save his life. I have tolerated your eccentricities, Griffin said, his voice cold and remote, the voice of a king pronouncing sentence on a criminal. I have tolerated your obsession with old superstitions and your disrespect for modern methods. I did this because of your past service, because you have been valuable to this pack. But I will not allow a traitor to fester in my ranks. I will not allow sabotage and conspiracy to go unpunished. He paused, and in that silence, Sutton heard her own heartbeat, thunderous and desperate. I find you guilty. A collective gasp rippled through the assembled pack. Some had expected it, but hearing the words made it real, made it final. The punishment for treason is death. Griffin continued, and Sutton felt her bladder clench, felt terror flood her system so completely that for a moment she couldn't breathe. But I will show mercy. You believe so fiercely in this coming winter. You think the wilderness holds answers that we've forgotten. Then you can face it alone. You can test your theories without endangering the rest of us. Banishment, not death, but something that might be worse. Without the pack bond, a wolf's soul withered, their immune system weakened, their minds slowly fractured under the weight of isolation. Most rogues died within a year, either from violence or from the simple inability to continue existing in a state so contrary to their fundamental nature. Griffin, please. Sutton's voice was barely a whisper, but in the silence of the amphitheater it carried. She wasn't begging for her life. She was begging for his sanity, for the pack's survival, for a chance to make him see reason before it was too late. If you cast me out, you break the Eastern Territorial Wards. The pack will be vulnerable. If you won't listen to me about the weather, at least listen about her. She managed to turn her head despite the weight of the command managed to look directly at Morgana. She's lying to you. She sold our coordinates to the Obsidian Syndicate. I've seen the communications, the encrypted files. She's been meeting with them for months. This whole thing is a setup to destabilize the pack before they move into... Griffin's hand was around her throat before she could finish the sentence. He moved with the speed of his wolf, despite being in human form, crossing the distance between them in less than a heartbeat. His fingers squeezed, cutting off her air, lifting her off her knees until her feet dangled above the ground. You will speak no more lies about my mate, he hissed, his face inches from hers, his eyes blazing gold with his wolf's rage. No more conspiracy theories. No more accusations. No more words. He released her, letting her fall. She hit the stone hard, gasping, her damaged lips splitting open again. Griffin placed his massive hand over the center of her chest, right over her heart. Right over the pack marked that every Stonehaven wolf wore an intricate tattoo of a howling wolf, entwined with mountain peaks, the symbol of their shared belonging, their connection to something greater than themselves. Sutton had received her mark 3 years ago on the night Griffin had formally accepted her into the pack. It had been one of the proudest moments of her life, the culmination of months of probationary service, the moment when she finally belonged somewhere after years of drifting. Now Griffin was going to tear it out of her. By my blood, Griffin intoned, and his voice carried the weight of ancient magic power that predated language, that reached back to the first wolves who had learned to wear human skin. By my bone, by the power vested in me as Alpha King of the Stonehaven Pack, I strip you of your name. The pain was beyond description. It felt like a white-hot fishhook had been driven into the center of her sternum and was now being pulled upward with inexorable force, dragging pieces of her soul out through her skin. The invisible threads that connected her to the pack, 438 individual bonds of shared emotion, shared strength, shared belonging, began to snap one by one. Each break was a small death. Each severed connection was a piece of herself being ripped away. She felt Vivienne's warmth disappear, the gratitude and affection that had existed between them since the day Sutton saved Ember. Gone. She felt Dashiell's respect vanish, the pride he had taken in being her student, the confidence she had helped him build. Gone. She felt Elder Thaddeus's ancient wisdom and quiet friendship tear away like paper in a hurricane. 438 connections. 438 deaths. All happening at once. Sutton screamed. It was a sound that no human throat should have been able to produce, raw and primal and completely animal. It echoed off the stone amphitheater, bounced back from the mountains, seemed to shake the very earth. The pack mark on her chest began to burn. Not metaphorically, actually burn. The ink blistered and blackened smoke rising from her skin as the magic that had bound it to her essence consumed itself. The howling wolf and mountain peaks twisted and writhed as if alive, as if trying to hold on, and then they were gone, leaving nothing but a raw, weeping scar in the shape of what she had lost. Sutton collapsed onto the stone, her body convulsing, her mind fragmenting under the weight of sudden absolute isolation. She had never truly understood what it meant to be alone before this moment. Even in her most isolated hours in the wilderness, she had always felt the pack at the back of her mind, a quiet presence that meant she was never truly by herself. Now there was nothing, a void where connection had been, an absence so profound it felt like drowning in vacuum. You are no longer Stonehaven, Griffin pronounced, and his voice seemed to come from very far away, filtered through the static of Sutton's disintegrating consciousness. You are rogue. If you are found within 60 miles of this territory by sunset tonight, you will be hunted and killed. Take her to the Deadlands. Vaughn Cross and 2 of his enforcers grabbed Sutton's convulsing body and dragged her toward the vehicles. She was barely conscious, her mind still reeling from the severance, her body going into shock. She was vaguely aware of being thrown into the back of a black SUV, of the engine starting, of the compound disappearing behind her. The drive to the Deadlands took 110 minutes. Sutton drifted in and out of consciousness, her body trying desperately to heal the unhealable, her mind trying to process the unprocessable. By the time they reached the Forbidden Zone, the sun was directly overhead, cold and distant, and offering no warmth. The Deadlands lived up to their name. Treacherous scree slopes, unstable ground, no water, no shelter, no game. A place where the earth itself seemed hostile to life. The perfect place to dump a wolf you wanted to die slowly, to suffer before the end. Vaughn cut the silver cuffs from her wrists and hauled her out of the vehicle. He threw her onto the frozen ground hard enough that she felt ribs crack. She lay there, unable to move, her ruined wrists leaving blood on the gray stone. Good luck with your weather, Pierce, Vaughn sneered, looking down at her with contempt. Then he climbed back into the SUV and drove away, leaving her utterly alone in the most forsaken stretch of wilderness in Montana. Sutton lay in the dirt for a long time. The physical agony of the severed pack bond made her violently ill every few minutes, her body purging in itself, as if trying to expel the poison of isolation. The psychological toll was somehow worse, the sensation of being adrift untethered, as if gravity had stopped applying to her and she might float away into nothing at any moment. But as she lay there, a snowflake landed on her cheek. It didn't melt. It sat there like a tiny shard of glass, cold and sharp and wrong. The temperature was dropping. Fast. Sutton forced herself to her hands and knees, then to her feet. She swayed, nearly fell, caught herself. Her wolf was weak from the severance, her human body was battered and broken, but she was still alive, still conscious, still capable of movement. She had no pack, no alpha, no protection, no connection to anything except the earth beneath her feet and the dying light above her head. But she had Elder Thaddeus's map tucked into her jacket pocket. She had preparation. She had knowledge. She had 40 years of warnings and survival lessons in the memory of her brother's frozen face. And she had 6 days of food and fuel and medical supplies hidden in a geothermal cave system that no one else knew existed. Sutton turned toward the north, toward the deepest part of the lands, toward the place where the Earth's volcanic heart still beat warm beneath the frozen stone. She started walking. Behind her, 90 miles away, Stonehaven's headquarters gleamed in the dying light. Inside the warm marble hallways, Griffin Lowell raised a champagne glass to celebrate the closing of the Riverbend acquisition. $720 million, the largest territorial expansion in Stonehaven's history. The champagne was imported $1,200 a bottle. In exactly 73 hours, it would freeze solid in the glass before Griffin could take a sip. But Sutton Pierce, the woman they had condemned to death, would already be safe in the deep earth, wrapped in warmth and preparation. Listening to the radio as her former alpha begged for forgiveness that would come far too late. The frost was coming, and it would prove her right in the most terrible way possible. The geothermal caves existed in a place that shouldn't have supported life. 8 miles into the Deadlands, past slopes of unstable scree that shifted underfoot like ball bearings, past crevasses hidden beneath crusts of old snow, past cliff faces that crumbled at a touch. The kind of terrain that killed experienced climbers in good weather. In the gathering storm, with her ribs cracked and her wrists still weeping from the silver burns, it should have killed Sutton Pierce. It didn't. She followed Elder Thaddeus's map with the single-minded focus of someone who had nothing left to lose. The hand-drawn landmarks were still visible, despite a century of fading. The split boulder shaped like a broken tooth, the frozen waterfall that marked the eastern approach, the ancient territorial marker carved by Thaddeus's grandfather in 1903. Each step was agony. Each breath felt like swallowing broken glass. But she kept moving. The temperature had dropped to 38 degrees below zero by the time she found the entrance. It was hidden exactly where the map said it would be, behind a wall of ice that had once been a waterfall, now frozen into a curtain of blue-white crystal. She used a rock to smash through her damaged hands, screaming in protest, until she revealed the narrow opening in the cliff face. The cave exhaled warm air. Not hot, not even particularly comfortable, but above freezing. Measurably and possibly above freezing in a world that was rapidly becoming uninhabitable. Sutton crawled through the opening and sealed the steel hatch behind her. The hatch she had installed herself 8 months ago in the aftermath of her brother's death, when paranoia had driven her to prepare for disasters that everyone else assured her would never come. She had hiked out here 6 times over the course of 3 months, carrying welding equipment and steel plate on her back, working in secret to create a sanctuary that she prayed she would never need. The prayer had gone unanswered. The cave system opened into a chamber roughly 650 square feet, carved by ancient lava flows into smooth-flowing walls. Volcanic vents deep in the earth still exhaled warmth through cracks in the stone floor, keeping the temperature hovering around 45 degrees. Not warm enough to be comfortable, but warm enough to survive. And Sutton had filled it with everything necessary to do exactly that. She lit the battery-powered lantern and surveyed her preparations with the detached focus of someone in shock. 220 days of freeze-dried food organized by caloric content and preparation requirements. 8 20-pound propane tanks for the 3 Mr. Heater Big Buddy units. Medical supplies that would stock a small field hospital, surgical kits, antibiotics, IV fluids, trauma supplies. A Remington 870 tactical shotgun with 150 shells. The Midland emergency radio with hand-cranked solar panel and battery backup. Clothing rated for 60 below zero. Water filtration systems. Everything she had spent her life savings to acquire. All of it purchased because on a cold morning in February of 2019, she had stood over her brother's frozen body and sworn that she would never again be caught unprepared. Cole's photograph sat propped against the cave wall in a waterproof case. 16 years old, grinning at the camera, holding up a fish he'd caught on their last camping trip together. 3 weeks before the avalanche. Sutton collapsed onto the thermal sleeping pad, her body finally surrendering to the accumulated trauma of the past 24 hours. The severance of the pack bond had left her immune system compromised. Her healing factor crippled her entire physiology, struggling to adjust to an isolation that went against every instinct coded into her DNA. For the first hour, she vomited until there was nothing left in her stomach. For the second and third hours, she shook with a fever that spiked to 105 degrees, her body trying to reject the reality of what had been done to it. By the fourth hour, she was hallucinating seeing Cole standing in the corner of the cave, seeing Griffin's face in the shadows, hearing the pack's voices echoing off the stone walls. She managed to start an IV line during a moment of clarity, pumping cold saline into her veins to combat the dehydration. She forced down antibiotics and fever reducers. She wrapped herself in every thermal blanket she had and waited for her body to either adapt or die. By hour 10, the fever finally broke. By hour 12, her hands had stopped shaking enough that she could hold a cup of water. By hour 14, she was able to think clearly again. That was when she turned on the Midland radio. The automated NOAA weather broadcast came through, first crisp and emotionless, and absolutely terrifying. Code Black weather emergency issued for western Montana and northern Idaho. Temperatures have fallen to 54 degrees below zero in Missoula, with wind chills approaching 85 below. This is an unprecedented meteorological event. All highways are closed. Interstate 90 has been shut down after an 80-car pileup near Alberton. Exposure in current conditions will result in frostbite in under 3 minutes and death in under 15 minutes. If you are not currently sheltered, seek immediate refuge. This is not a drill. This is a Code Black emergency. The broadcast repeated and repeated and repeated. Sutton sat listening to it, her hands wrapped around a cup of reconstituted soup, feeling nothing. No vindication, no satisfaction. Just a vast, empty hollowness where her connection to the pack wound had been. She had been right. She had been right about everything. And 438 people were about to pay the price for not believing her. Then the local ham radio frequencies came alive with human voices. Survivalists, rural residents, people with the equipment and knowledge to communicate when modern infrastructure failed. This is Red Lodge Station. We've lost all power. Backup generators are frozen solid. Temperature inside the building is dropping. We're burning furniture, but it's not enough. Big Fork calling anyone. The propane lines froze and ruptured. We can't get heat. We're packing everyone into the basement with the livestock, but we're losing people. Kalispell Emergency Services. National Guard cannot mobilize. Helicopters grounded. Roads impassable. We're estimating hundreds of casualties in the valley alone. Sutton listened to the world ending in real time, one desperate transmission after another. And still she felt nothing. The severance had taken more than just her pack connection. It had taken some essential part of her capacity to feel leaving behind only a cold, analytical detachment. Then the radio crackled with a frequency she recognized. The Stonehaven Emergency Channel, and Griffin Lowell's voice filled the cave. This is Alpha Blackthorn on Emergency Protocol Omega. All pack members, immediate evacuation to Western Archives. The freeze that Sutton warned about is real. Temperature is 52 degrees below zero and falling. Main power grid is down. We need everyone in the archives immediately. Bring every blanket, every heat source, every... Static consumed his words for a moment. Then his voice came back, rougher, more desperate. Sutton Pierce, if you're somehow listening to this frequency, if you're alive out there, you were right. God help me, you were right about everything. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I should have listened. I should have... The transmission dissolved into static and didn't return. Sutton sat frozen, the soup forgotten in her hands, staring at the radio as if it had physically struck her. He knew. They all knew now. The vindication she had thought she didn't want didn't need hit her like a freight train. She had been right, and they were dying. The pups. 31 pups listed in the pack registry ranging from 6 months old to 15 years. Ember Caldwell, 8 years old, who collected butterflies and called Sutton Aunt Sutton, even though they weren't related. Dashiell, 17, who was supposed to leave for college in the fall. The infants in the pack nursery who couldn't even shift yet, who had no defense against the cold except the adults around them. The elders. Thaddeus, who had given her the map that saved her life. Minerva, who had taught her to identify medicinal plants. Solomon, who could recite the pack's history back 7 generations. They were all in the Western Archives right now, huddled together for warmth, burning whatever they could find, and it wouldn't be enough. She knew the archives. She had surveyed them herself 2 years ago. The insulation was minimal. The ventilation was designed for summer use. In 50 below temperatures, the ambient air inside would drop below zero within hours. They were going to freeze to death in the dark, surrounded by all the wealth and technology and infrastructure that Griffin had insisted would protect them. Sutton's hands started shaking again, but this time it wasn't from fever. It was rage and grief and a terrible crushing guilt that she couldn't quite justify but felt anyway. She had prepared. She had warned them. She had done everything possible to make them listen. But children were dying, and some dark, wounded part of her whispered that maybe she could have tried harder, warned louder, been more convincing somehow. They exiled you, she said out loud, her voice harsh in the silence of the cave. They destroyed you. They left you today. You don't owe them anything. But even as she said it, she was reaching for her tactical gear, because the adults had exiled her. Griffin had struck her. Morgana had framed her. Morgana. Vaughn had dumped her in the Deadlands to die slowly, but the pups hadn't done any of that. The pups were innocent, and Sutton Pierce didn't punish children for their parents' sins. She was packing the rescue sled when she heard the sound at the hatch. At first she thought it was the wind. The Wendigo Winter was howling outside with the voice of something ancient and hungry, wind speeds exceeding 80 miles per hour, carrying ice crystals sharp enough to flay exposed skin. But this sound was different, rhythmic, deliberate. Thud, thud, scrape. Something was outside, something was trying to get in. At 61 degrees below zero, nothing should have been alive out there. Even a fully shifted alpha wolf would succumb to hypothermia in under 20 minutes. The cold would freeze the moisture in their lungs, crystallize the fluid around their brain, shut down organ systems one by one until they simply stopped. Sutton grabbed the Remington, chambering a slug with a sound that was very loud in the enclosed space. She pulled on her neoprene face mask, her insulated gloves, her goggles. Then she climbed the ladder to the hatch and unbolted the seals. The moment she cracked it open an inch, the cold hit her like a physical assault. It didn't feel like temperature. It felt like the absence of heat, like a void that actively sucked warmth from anything it touched. Her exposed eyes began to water immediately, the tears freezing on her lashes. She shoved the hatch fully open and leveled the shotgun at the darkness. A wolf lay collapsed on the ice-covered grate. But this wasn't a normal pack wolf. This was massive, easily 4.5 feet at the shoulder when standing with a coat so black it seemed to absorb light. The fur was matted with thick icicles, some as large as Sutton's forearm. Deep lacerations tore across the wolf's flank and shoulder, the blood frozen into black streaks that looked like cracks in obsidian. The wolf raised its head with tremendous effort. Its eyes were golden amber, bright and intelligent, and completely feral. It locked gazes with Sutton and let out a low, rattling whine that she felt in her chest. Then its eyes rolled back and it collapsed, entirely blocking the hatch. "Damn it," Sutton whispered into the howling wind. Survival rule number 1 in the Deadlands: you don't take in strays. You don't risk your own resources, your own safety, your own carefully calculated survival for someone you don't know. Especially not for a wolf that size, that powerful, that potentially dangerous. But Sutton had already broken so many rules. What was one more? She slung the shotgun over her shoulder, grabbed the massive wolf by the scruff of its neck, and pulled. Even with her augmented werewolf strength, it was like trying to move a boulder. 295 pounds of unconscious alpha was nearly dead weight. She braced her feet and hauled backward, using the slick ice to her advantage, sliding the wolf inch by agonizing inch down the shaft and into the cave. She slammed the hatch shut and spun the locking wheel just as the wind shrieked against the metal, like something alive and furious at being denied entry. In the relative warmth of the cave, the wolf's body began to react immediately. The involuntary shift started within seconds. Bones cracking and reforming with sounds like breaking branches. Fur retreating into skin, muscle, and sinew, restructuring themselves. It was violent and graceless, the kind of shift that only happened during severe trauma, when the body was trying desperately to conserve heat and resources. Within 30 seconds, a man lay unconscious on her cave floor. He was built like someone who had spent decades surviving through sheer physical strength, broad shoulders, corded muscle, a body that carried no excess fat because there had never been enough food for luxury. His skin was pale from the cold, but mapped with silvered scars, the kind that werewolf healing didn't fully erase because they had been made with silver or inflicted during a shift or reopened so many times that the tissue simply gave up trying to heal perfectly. His hair was dark, shot through with gray at the temples, despite him looking no older than late 30s. His jaw was covered with a thick beard that had probably started as practicality and become permanent, and his hands, even unconscious, were curled into loose fists as if he was used to fighting even in sleep. Sutton knelt beside him and checked his pulse. 38 beats per minute, dangerously low. His core temperature would be hovering somewhere in the high 80s, well into severe hypothermia territory. She had maybe 20 minutes before his heart simply stopped. She worked with the efficiency of someone who had trained for this exact scenario. Chemical heat packs against the major arteries, neck, armpits, groin. An IV line in his arm, warm saline flowing into his veins. She cleaned the deep gashes on his side and shoulder. They looked like he'd been sideswiped by a vehicle or dragged across barbed wire at high speed, and closed the worst of them with surgical staples. Her hands didn't shake, didn't hesitate. This was just another problem to solve, another crisis to manage. She had become very good at managing crises. It took 4 hours for his core temperature to rise above 95 degrees, another hour before his heart rate stabilized above 60. By the 6th hour, his color had improved from corpse gray to merely pale, and his breathing had evened out into something that resembled actual sleep. Sutton sat in a folding chair a few feet away, the shotgun across her lap, watching him. She should have been exhausted. She should have been overwhelmed by everything that had happened in the past 48 hours, exile, severance, near death, and now this. But the strange detachment that had settled over her since the pack bond was torn away kept her thoughts clear and cold. She studied the stranger's scars with professional interest. The silvered ones on his ribs looked like claw marks from another wolf. The long raised line across his collarbone could have been a knife or possibly a broken bottle. The burn scar on his left shoulder was old, maybe 20 years. The kind of injury that happened to children in house fires or adults in industrial accidents. This was someone who had survived things that would have killed most wolves. Someone who had lived hard and fought harder and somehow kept breathing through it all. The question was why he had been out in a Wendigo Winter miles into the Deadlands, injured and alone. His eyes open. For a moment, he just stared at the cave ceiling, his expression blank. Then awareness flooded back, and he was moving before conscious thought engaged a primal survival instinct that went straight from unconsciousness to full combat readiness in the space of a heartbeat. He bolted upright with a snarl, his eyes flashing amber gold, his body coiling to attack or flee, or both simultaneously. His gaze swept the cave, the supplies, the lanterns, the stranger with a shotgun, and locked onto Sutton. She didn't move, just kept the Remington aimed at center mass and spoke in the same calm, authoritative tone she'd used to talk down charging elk and panicked pack members. Easy, you're in my cave. It's 65 degrees below zero outside with wind chills approaching 90 below. You try to shift with those wounds, you'll bleed out from the staples I just put in your side. Or I'll shoot you. None of those are good options for you. He stared at her, breathing hard, clearly assessing threat levels. His eyes went to the raw, blistered scar on her chest where her pack mark had been. Recognition flickered across his face. He knew what that meant, knew what it cost. Slowly, carefully, he lowered his hands and leaned back against the cave wall. You're Stonehaven, he said. His voice was deep and rough like gravel tumbling in a cement mixer. Was, Sutton corrected sharply. Who are you, and what the hell were you doing out in a Wendigo Winter? Declan Ashford, he said, rubbing a hand over his face, wincing as the movement pulled at his freshly stapled wounds. Former alpha of the Thornridge pack. Sutton's finger tightened fractionally on the trigger. Griffin Lowell's father wiped out Thornridge 24 years ago in the territorial wars. You're supposed to be dead. Yeah, well. Declan's mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile, if there was any humor in it. I've been supposed to be dead for 24 years. Turns out I'm stubborn. He looked up at the ceiling of the cave, listening to the muffled howl of the wind outside. I was 14 when Marcus Lowell decided he wanted our territory. We had prime riverfront, good hunting grounds, clean water. His pack was growing and he needed the space, so he framed our beta for killing human hikers. Made it look like a rogue wolf attack, brought in federal marshals. Declan's voice went flat, empty of everything except old cold pain. It was a massacre. 52 wolves, my parents. My sister, she was 12. I was out on a tracking run with 2 others when it happened. We came back to find everyone dead. The humans left. Marcus Lowell's wolves moved in the next day, planted their flag on our bones and built their glass monument to corporate greed right on top of our ancestral den site. He met Sutton's eyes. I've been surviving in the deep country ever since. Watching, waiting, planning to return the favor when the time was right. And you decided to make your move during a Wendigo Winter? Sutton asked incredulously. That's possibly the stupidest thing I've ever heard. I wasn't making a move, Declan said, his tone sharp. My cave system collapsed under the ice load. Tons of frozen stone just came down like an avalanche. I barely got out. I was tracking a thermal vent signature when I smelled your propane exhaust. Followed it here. Didn't exactly expect to find a Stonehaven exile playing survival prepper. Before Sutton could respond, the Midland radio on the shelf crackled to life again. This time it wasn't Griffin's voice. It was Vaughn Cross, and he sounded like a man at the end of his rope. Anyone? This is Stonehaven security on emergency frequency. If anyone can hear this. Sutton lunged for the radio, nearly dropping it in her haste. Declan sat forward, wincing as his stitches pulled. Vaughn's voice was weak, shivering, the words coming in halting gasps. 89 confirmed dead. Luna Morgana locked herself in the Alpha bunker with Obsidian Syndicate operatives. She overrode the biometric access. We can't get in. The rest of us. We're trapped in the Western Archives. Temperature inside is 21 degrees below zero and dropping. There was a sound that might have been sobbing, or might have been just the chattering of teeth. The pups. We're losing them. Vivian Caldwell's daughter, Ember. She's gone. Dashiell lost both feet to frostbite. We had to amputate with kitchen knives because we don't have medical supplies. Static then, Sutton. I know you're probably dead. I know we don't deserve. But if you're alive, if you're listening, we were wrong. God forgive us, we were so wrong, please. If there's any mercy in you, we're dying. The transmission cut off. Sutton stood motionless, the radio clutched in her hands, staring at nothing. 89 dead. Ember Caldwell, who had loved butterflies and called her Aunt Sutton, frozen solid. Dashiell, 17 years old, losing both feet because there was no other choice. And Morgana. Morgana Drake had locked herself in the bunker with the Syndicate operatives who had paid her to destroy Stonehaven from within, leaving 438 wolves to freeze to death in the dark. Sutton turned to Declan. Her face was completely calm, her voice was steady, but her eyes held something cold and terrible and utterly implacable. You wanted revenge on Stonehaven. Declan looked at her, his amber eyes unreadable. I did. Change of plans, Sutton said, reaching for her tactical gear. You helped me save them. Then I'm going to kill Morgana Drake. Declan was quiet for a long moment. Then he pushed himself to his feet, grimacing at the pain in his side. You're certifiably insane, Pierce. It's 65 below zero out there with wind chills that will snap the flesh off your bones in 10 minutes. We won't make it halfway to Stonehaven. I didn't ask if it was smart, Sutton said, checking her gear with mechanical precision. I asked if you're coming. Declan studied her, this woman who had been betrayed and exiled and literally torn apart by the very people she was now preparing to save. This woman who had pulled him from certain death and stabilized him with professional efficiency despite having every reason to leave him outside to freeze. This woman who looked at impossible odds and suicidal missions and said yes, anyway. I don't give a damn about Griffin Lowell's pack, Declan said slowly, but I do care about the Obsidian Syndicate. If Morgana's selling out territory to them, they're making a play for the entire Northern Rockies. They won't stop at Stonehaven. They'll bulldoze these mountains, pave over every sacred site, erase every pack that doesn't submit to their corporate restructuring. He reached for his own clothes, checking them for usability. Plus, I know a way into that compound, a way Morgana wouldn't know to block. The old Thornridge geothermal vent system runs directly under what used to be our ancestral den site. Marcus Lowell built his glass palace right on top of it, but the vents are still there. If we can reach the exterior access point, we can bypass their security entirely. The vents will be buried under 20 feet of snow, Sutton said. Then we better start digging, Declan replied. They geared up in silence, each of them moving with the practiced efficiency of people who had spent their lives preparing for disaster that everyone else insisted would never come. Extreme cold weather gear, layers of thermal protection, Gore-Tex outer shells rated for 60 below neoprene face masks, insulated gloves, crampons for the ice. Sutton strapped the 85-pound rescue sled to her chest harness. Declan, despite his injuries, armed himself with 2 ice axes and 200 feet of climbing rope. Before they opened the hatch, Sutton looked at Declan one more time. Why are you really doing this? She asked. The truth. Declan was quiet for a moment. Then, because when Marcus Lowell massacred my pack, I was 14 years old and I couldn't do anything except hide and survive. I've spent 24 years hating myself for that, for surviving when everyone else died, for not being strong enough or smart enough or brave enough to make a difference. He met her eyes. You're giving me a chance to be someone who saves people instead of someone who just watches them die. I'm taking it. Sutton nodded once. Then she opened the hatch. The world outside was unrecognizable. The Wendigo Winter had transformed the Montana wilderness into an alien landscape of absolute hostility. The towering lodgepole pines were encased in ice so thick they looked like crystal sculptures groaning under weight they were never designed to carry. The sky was the color of a weeks-old bruised purple-black and swollen vomiting snow that fell in sheets so dense that visibility dropped to less than 8 feet. The wind didn't howl. It screamed a sound like metal tearing, like the earth itself was being ripped apart. 85 miles per hour sustained with gusts approaching 100. Strong enough to pick up a full-grown wolf and throw them into a ravine. And the cold. God, the cold. It hit them like a hammer made of frozen voids, sucking the heat from their bodies so fast that even through layers of insulation, Sutton could feel her core temperature beginning to drop within seconds. Each breath felt like inhaling broken glass mixed with fire, the air so cold it burned. Stay within arm's reach. Declan roared over the wind, his voice barely audible even from 2 feet away. Open ground will kill you. The crosswinds will throw you off the mountain. They started moving. What should have been a 3-hour run for a wolf in good conditions became a nightmare trek that would take them 11 hours. They couldn't shift. Exposing bare wolf paws and muzzles to this temperature would result in instant frostbite frozen tissue that even werewolf healing couldn't repair fast enough. They had to stay human, had to rely on their gear and their will, and their sheer, stubborn refusal to die. Declan broke trail using his bulk and strength to punch through chest-high drifts, his ice axes providing anchor points on the treacherous slopes. Sutton followed the sled, dragging behind her like an anchor, every step requiring conscious effort against the wind that tried to push her backwards sideways, anywhere except forward. After 6 hours, they had covered less than 5 miles. Sutton's hands were numb inside her gloves. Declan's face, even behind the neoprene mask, was beginning to show the waxy white patches of frostbite. They took shelter in a rock outcropping barely large enough for both of them, sharing a single emergency heat pack pressed between their chests, trying to warm their core temperatures enough to continue. 60 seconds. That's all they allowed themselves. 60 seconds of relative warmth and stillness, while the Wendigo Winter raged around them like a living thing that wanted them dead. We're not going to make it, Declan said, and it wasn't fear in his voice, just cold assessment. At this pace, we're still 6 hours out. Neither of us has 6 hours left. Sutton pulled out her GPS unit. The screen was cracked from the cold, but it still functioned. She studied the terrain map, her mind calculating distances and routes with the same methodical focus that had kept her alive this long. There, she said, pointing to a feature on the map. Hidden crevasse system. Runs for 3 miles almost directly towards Stonehaven. It'll get us out of the wind, cut our time by half. Crevasses in unstable snowpack during a Wendigo winter, Declan said flatly. That's a death wish. So is staying out here, Sutton replied. Move. They found the crevasse entrance exactly where the map indicated. A dark split in the snow barely wide enough for a human body descending into blue-black shadow. Sutton went first, rappelling down into the earth, the rope singing through her harness. Declan followed his greater weight, making the descent more complicated, but he managed. At the bottom, 50 feet below the surface, the wind suddenly stopped. The temperature was still 60 below zero, but without the wind chill factor, it felt almost warm, almost survivable. They moved through the crevasse system like ghosts, their headlamps cutting weak beams through the darkness. The ice walls pressed in on both sides, sometimes so narrow they had to turn sideways to pass. But they were making progress. Real progress. 3 miles in 2 hours instead of 6. When they finally emerged, Stonehaven's compound was visible in the distance. A sprawling complex of glass and steel that was now completely dark, completely dead, completely encased in ice so thick it looked like a tomb carved from a glacier. They were 500 yards away when the ground collapsed beneath Declan's feet. The snow bridge over the hidden crevasse gave way without warning, without sound, just a sudden absence of support. Declan fell, his massive frame disappearing into the blue void, and the rope connecting them snapped taut with a force that yanked Sutton forward like she'd been harpooned. She slammed onto her stomach, her solar plexus compressed, unable to breathe. The sled behind her acted like an anchor, dragging her toward the edge as Declan's weight pulled the rope through the snow. She dug her crampons in, found purchase held. She was 18 inches from the edge, holding 295 pounds of unconscious or dead alpha, dangling over a 70-foot drop onto jagged ice. "Cut the line," Declan's voice echoed up from the darkness. "The bridge is giving way. It'll take you down with me." Sutton wrapped the rope around her forearm, ignoring the searing pain as it cut through her jacket and into her skin. Blood began to seep. She didn't care. "Shut up and climb," she roared back, and she began to pull. It was impossible. Every law of physics said she shouldn't be able to do it. A 140-pound woman hauling 295 pounds of dead weight up a 70-foot vertical ice wall while wearing a harness connected to an 85-pound sled, while suffering from hypothermia and blood loss and recently severed pack bond trauma. Impossible. She did it anyway, centimeter by centimeter, her muscles tearing, her hands bleeding. Her teeth gritted so hard she felt a molar crack. The rope cutting deeper into her arm with every pull. Her vision narrowing to a tunnel, her world reducing to nothing except the next pull, the next inch gained against gravity and physics and the universe itself. 28 minutes. When Declan's gloved hands finally appeared over the edge, when he hauled his upper body onto solid ice and collapsed gasping, Sutton let go of the rope and fell backward into the snow. They lay there for 10 seconds, both of them breathing like they'd run a marathon, their breath forming clouds that froze and fell as ice crystals. Declan rolled onto his side and stared at her. "You didn't cut the line." "I don't abandon my people," Sutton said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not your people. You don't even know me." "You became my people when I pulled you into my cave," Sutton replied. She pushed herself up, ignoring the blood soaking through her sleeve. "Now get moving, we're almost there." Declan looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time. Not a Stonehaven exile, not a desperate woman on a suicide mission. Something else entirely. An alpha in her own right. They covered the last 500 yards in 20 minutes. When they reached the cliff face on the eastern edge of Stonehaven's property, Declan led her to a section of rock obscured by 15 feet of frozen waterfall. He raised his ice axe and began to swing, and Sutton could see 24 years of rage in every impact. The ice shattered. The waterfall came down in chunks the size of refrigerators. Behind it, exactly where he said it would be, was an iron grate set into the rock. Corroded, ancient, but still intact. And on the grate, barely visible beneath a century of oxidation, was a crest, a stylized thornbird in flight. Thornridge. "My great-grandfather installed this in 1899, Declan said, his voice tight. "Emergency escape route. Marcus Lowell never knew it existed, and his son definitely doesn't." He wrenched the grate open, and warm air flowed out. The geothermal vents were still active, still breathing heat from the Earth's molten core. They crawled into the tunnel. Half a mile of horizontal passage through solid rock, pitch black, the walls close enough to touch on both sides. But it wasn't frozen, and it led directly into the sub-basement of Stonehaven's headquarters. When they dropped through the ventilation grate into the compound, the first thing Sutton noticed was the silence. No HV, AC systems running, no lights, no signs of life, just dead air hovering at 4 degrees Fahrenheit. The second thing she noticed was the sound of 400 wolves dying slowly in the western wing. Declan looked at her. "You ready?" Sutton chambered around in the Remington and started walking. "Let's go save some lives, then we're going to have a conversation with Morgana Drake." The reinforced oak doors of the Western Archives were barricaded from the inside. Sutton could hear the desperation in the silence beyond them. Not the quiet of peace, but the terrible stillness of people trying to conserve every breath, every movement, every calorie of warmth. She raised her boot and kicked. The impact echoed through the frozen hallways like a gunshot. Wood splintered. The barricade behind the doors shifted. She kicked again, and this time the doors burst inward, the makeshift furniture that had been piled against them tumbling aside. The smell hit her first, fierce sweat and human waste, and the sweet, sickly odor of frostbite turning flesh necrotic. Then the visual reality resolved itself in the beam of her headlamp, and Sutton felt something crack in the cold armor she'd built around herself since the severance. 197 wolves huddled in a mass in the center of the massive room, their bodies pressed together in a desperate attempt to share heat that none of them had to spare. They were wrapped in everything that could be torn apart and repurposed: tapestries ripped from the walls, upholstery stripped from chairs, curtains that had once cost thousands of dollars now serving as shrouds for the living. And surrounding them, arranged in a terrible perimeter, were the dead. 89 bodies, frozen solid. Most of them were elders and pups, the most vulnerable. Some had died sitting upright, their eyes still open, ice crystals coating their lashes. Others had collapsed mid-movement and been left where they fell because moving them would require heat the living couldn't spare. Sutton's headlamp beam found Elder Thaddeus in the far corner. He had died standing his back against the wall, his arms wrapped around a collection of ancient scrolls, the pack's historical records, the genealogies and stories that went back 7 generations. He had died protecting their memory even as his own life crystallized in his veins. The beam swept further and found Vivian Caldwell. She sat against a pillar, alive but catatonic, her 8-year-old daughter Ember's frozen body cradled in her lap. She was rocking slowly, humming a lullaby, her eyes fixed on something no one else could see. Her son Ryland, 10 years old, sat beside her, his small hand on her shoulder, his face ancient with grief. And there in the center of the huddle, stripped down to a torn undershirt despite the killing cold, was Griffin Lowell. The Alpha King had given away every piece of clothing he could spare. His suit jacket wrapped around a shivering teenager, his shirt on an elderly female, his socks on a pup whose own had been lost to frostbite. He sat with his arms around 2 adolescent wolves, using his body heat to keep them alive, even as his own lips turned blue and his skin took on the gray-white pallor of severe hypothermia. When Sutton's headlamp beam hit his face, Griffin looked up slowly, his movements sluggish with cold. For a moment, he just stared, his eyes unfocused. Then recognition sparked and his expression crumbled into something raw and devastated. Sutton. Her name came out as barely a whisper, rough and broken. Vaughn Cross limped forward from the shadows and Sutton almost didn't recognize him. The head of security who had sneered at her warnings and thrown her into the Deadlands to die was now a broken man. His face was purple with bruising from an explosion she would learn about later. His left hand was wrapped in bloody frozen cloth, 3 fingers missing, self-amputated, with a kitchen knife to stop the frostbite from spreading up his arm. He collapsed to his knees in front of her, all arrogance stripped away, replaced by naked desperation. "You came back," he said, his voice cracking. "After everything we did to you, after we destroyed you, you came back." He was crying now, tears freezing on his cheeks almost instantly. "We were wrong, so wrong. You were right about everything. We deserve to die here. We deserve all of this. But the pups don't, please. The pups don't deserve this." Sutton didn't waste time on recriminations or vindication. She turned to Declan, her voice sharp and commanding. "Deploy the big buddy heaters. All 3, propane connections. I need this room at 48 degrees in 6 minutes, or we start losing more of them." Declan moved with military precision, unslinging the rescue sled and pulling out the industrial propane heaters with practiced efficiency. He had the first one assembled and ignited in 90 seconds. The whooshing sound of propane catching fire was the most beautiful thing any of them had ever heard. Heat, real substantial life-saving heat, began to radiate outward in waves. A sob rippled through the huddled mass of wolves. Some started crying, others just turned their faces toward the warmth, like flowers toward the sun, too exhausted or traumatized to manage anything else. Sutton was already moving, her field medic training taking over. She knelt beside Vivian, gently checking the woman's vitals while trying not to disturb her grip on Ember's body. "Vivian, look at me." Sutton's voice was firm but not unkind. "Vivian, I need you to focus. Ryland needs you. Your son needs his mother. Can you hear me?" Vivian's eyes slowly focused on Sutton's face. Recognition flickered, followed by confusion, then guilt so profound it was almost physical. "You came back," she whispered. "I watched them exile you. I didn't say anything. I just sat there, and you came back anyway." "We'll deal with that later," Sutton said, wrapping a heated mylar blanket around Vivian's shoulders while carefully including Ember's body. The girl would need to be properly buried when the winter broke. But for now, her mother needed to hold her. "Right now, I need you to stay present for Ryland. Can you do that?" Vivian looked at her son, really looked at him for the first time in hours. The boy's face crumpled, and he buried himself in his mother's arms. Vivian held him tight, her sobs muffled against his hair. Across the room, Sutton found Dashiell. The 17-year-old who had been her best tracking student was unconscious, his breathing shallow and labored. Both of his feet were gone below the ankles, the stumps wrapped in cloth that had frozen to the wounds. Crude amputation done with whatever tools were available, performed by people with no medical training, in conditions that guaranteed infection if he lived long enough for it to matter. Sutton set up an IV line, pumping warm saline into his veins, administering antibiotics and pain medication. His survival was far from guaranteed, but at least now he had a chance. Griffin finally stood his movements stiff and painful. He looked at Sutton across the warming room, and something in his expression made him look decades older than his 35 years. "You survived," he said quietly. "You prepared, and you brought help." His eyes shifted to Declan, taking in the scarred, dangerous-looking stranger who was currently saving his pack's lives. "Who are you?" Declan straightened from where he'd been checking the second heater's propane connection. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old ghosts and older rage. "Declan Ashford, true alpha of the Thornridge pack." He let that sink in for a moment, watching Griffin's face drain of what little color it still had. "The pack your father Marcus massacred 24 years ago so he could build this glass tomb on our bones. I was 14. I survived by hiding while 52 of my people were slaughtered." He gestured around the room at the dead and dying. "Right now, I'm the only reason your pups aren't frozen corpses. So you're going to stand there and be grateful, Lowell. And then we're going to have a conversation about your Luna and the Obsidian Syndicate." Griffin swayed on his feet, whether from hypothermia or the weight of revelations Sutton couldn't tell. "Morgana," he said, his voice hollow. "She sold us out. To the Syndicate. Locked herself in the Alpha bunker with their operatives. She overrode my biometric access. I couldn't get in. Couldn't get the supplies, the food, the medicine." He looked at Sutton, and there was nothing left in him but broken honesty. "I failed them. I failed everyone. You tried to warn me and I struck you. I exiled you. I destroyed you for trying to save us." "I know," Sutton said, and her voice held no warmth at all. "It was just a statement of fact, cold and clean." She moved past him without another word, kneeling beside another patient who needed attention. Griffin flinched like she'd hit him. "We need to get into that bunker," Sutton said, pulling out her tablet and calling up the building's schematic from memory. "The food reserves, medical supplies, and climate control systems are all down there. How many are in critical condition?" Vaughn limped over his remaining fingers, clutching a tattered notebook. 43 critical, 62 serious but stable. The rest are ambulatory. If we don't get them real food and proper heat within 12 hours, we'll lose at least 20 more. The bunker is titanium reinforced, Griffin said, his voice dead. Rated for direct missile strike. We tried everything. Plasma cutters, hydraulic rams. The doors won't budge, and Morgana's override locked out every access code I have. Sutton looked at Declan. He was already pulling something from his pack, the thermal detonator she'd brought from her cave, the same kind Morgana had used to frame her for the freezer sabotage. Sutton met his eyes and saw her own cold determination reflected back. Your father built his fortress on top of Thornridge territory, Declan said, moving toward the door, but he never found all our infrastructure. The Alpha bunker sits directly over our ancestral geothermal system. The floor has a structural weakness. Thermal expansion warped the titanium over 2 decades. There's a hairline fracture in the southeastern quadrant. He looked at Griffin with something that wasn't quite a smile. We're not going through the doors. We're blowing the ceiling out from under her feet and coming up through the floor. The sub-basement of Stonehaven's headquarters was a concrete labyrinth that smelled of mold and old stone. But beneath the modern infrastructure, if you knew where to look, you could see the bones of what had come before, ancient territorial markers carved into rock vent systems that predated electricity, the architectural signatures of a pack that had lived here for generations before they were erased. Declan navigated it like a ghost returning home. His great-grandfather had mapped these tunnels in 1903. His grandfather had expanded them in the 30s. His father had maintained them right up until the day Marcus Lowell's wolves had ripped his throat out in front of his children. 24 years, and Declan had never forgotten a single turn. Griffin and Vaughn followed behind Sutton and Declan, their headlamps cutting weak beams through the darkness. The temperature down here was marginally warmer, barely above zero, but without the wind, it felt almost survivable. Declan stopped at a section of wall that looked like every other section of wall. He ran his hand over the concrete, feeling for something invisible to the others, and found it a hidden seam. He wedged his ice axe into the gap and pried. The false wall swung outward, revealing a narrow shaft that led straight up into darkness. Your father poured 65 feet of reinforced concrete over these vents, Declan said to Griffin. Tried to erase every trace of Thornridge from existence. But concrete is rigid. Titanium is rigid. Heat makes things expand. He shone his headlamp up the shaft. 24 years of geothermal heat cycling through this system, and the bunker floor directly above us has warped. The southeastern corner has a crack wide enough to wedge a breaching charge. Sutton was already assembling the thermal detonator, her hands steady despite the cold. Poetic justice, she said quietly. Morgana used my equipment to frame me as a saboteur. Tried to make you all think I was destroying the pack from within. She looked up at Griffin, her amber eyes reflecting the headlamp beam. Now my equipment is going to tear her sanctuary open and expose her for exactly what she is. She set the timer for 90 seconds and wedged the device into the fracture with precision, born of years placing avalanche charges. Then she hit the ignition switch. Run. They sprinted back down the tunnel, their boots pounding on stone. Vaughn's injured legs slowed him down, and Declan grabbed him bodily, half carrying him to safety. They dove behind a reinforced concrete support wall just as the timer hit 0. The explosion wasn't fire. It was a hyper-concentrated thermal lance designed to melt through rock and sever steel. The sound was like the earth itself splitting open, a deep bass thrum that Sutton felt in her bones. The ground shook violently. Molten titanium rained down through the shaft in glowing droplets, and the air filled with concrete dust and the sharp ozone smell of superheated metal. A rush of warm air followed warm, stale, climate-controlled air at 74 degrees Fahrenheit. Go, go, go! Declan was already moving, surging up the collapsed rubble of the shaft, his claws extending, using the momentum of his wolf strength, even in human form, to launch himself through the jagged, smoking hole in the ceiling. Sutton was right behind him, the Remington 870 tactical shotgun in her hands, loaded and ready. They emerged into a scene of such obscene luxury that it momentarily froze them in place. The Alpha bunker was a masterclass in underground opulence. Soft amber lighting illuminated rich mahogany walls and butter-soft leather furniture. A massive dining table dominated the center of the room, and on it sat an untouched feast. Roasted duck with cherry glaze, artisan cheeses, caviar on ice, fresh fruit that must have been flown in before the storm, and bottles of wine that probably cost more than most people's cars. 5 heavily armed mercenaries in tactical gear stood around the room holding HK-416 assault rifles. 3 men in bespoke suits, syndicate executives, sat at the table with glasses of $18,000 Chateau d'Yquem halfway to their lips. And at the head of the table, looking like she was hosting a dinner party, while 400 wolves froze to death 50 feet above her, sat Morgana Drake. Her platinum blonde hair was perfect. Her makeup was flawless. Her ice blue eyes were wide with shock as a demon covered in ash and blood hauled himself through a smoking hole in her floor, followed by the woman she'd framed for treason and left to die. Beside Morgana sat a silver-haired man in his 60s wearing a suit that cost more than a luxury car. Sterling Voss, CEO of the Obsidian Syndicate, the man who had orchestrated the destruction of 12 packs in the past decade, carving up territories and selling them to the highest bidder. He dropped his fork, his face drained of color. What in God's name? Kill them! Morgana's scream was shrill, all her polished composure shattering. The 5 mercenaries raised their rifles in synchronized precision. They were well-trained, well-equipped professionals who had probably handled dozens of situations exactly like this. They were also fatally outmatched. Declan moved faster than human eyes could track the wolf in him, surfacing just enough to give him speed that shouldn't have been possible. He grabbed the closest rifle barrel and crushed it in his grip, the steel crumpling like aluminum foil. His other hand shot out and caught the mercenary by the throat, lifting him off his feet and throwing him across the room. The man hit an antique cabinet and went through it in an explosion of wood and glass. Sutton racked the Remington and fired. The slug blew the main electrical junction off the wall in a shower of sparks, plunging the room into chaotic, flickering emergency lighting that strobed red and white. She chambered another round without pause. Drop your weapons, or I start taking limbs. The remaining 4 mercenaries looked at the 6'4" Alpha bearing down on them with murder in his eyes, looked at the woman with the shotgun, who had clearly lost any concern for her own safety, and made the only intelligent decision available. They dropped their rifles and raised their hands. Griffin and Vaughn hauled themselves up through the hole in the sight of their Alpha, battered, frostbitten, but alive and burning with fury, broke whatever remaining resistance the mercenaries might have mustered. Morgana scrambled backward, her designer heels catching on her chair, sending her sprawling. All her polish, all her carefully constructed corporate predator persona stripped away to reveal the panic underneath. Griffin. Her voice was desperate, reaching for him like a lifeline. Thank God you're here. The system malfunctioned. The bunker door's locked, and I couldn't override them from in here. Sterling and I were just trying to figure out how to get them open. Griffin crossed the room in 3 strides. He didn't speak, didn't yell, just reached out with one massive hand and wrapped it around her throat, lifting her off the floor until her expensive heels dangled in empty air. You sold my territory, Griffin said, and his voice was so low, so cold, that it made the emergency lighting seem warm by comparison. You poisoned our food reserves. You framed the only person who could have saved us. You locked me out of this bunker while pups froze to death in the dark. While Ember Caldwell died because we had no medicine. While Dashiell lost his feet because we had no tools. Sterling Voss stood, his hands raised in a placating gesture. Mr. Lowell, please. Let's be reasonable. This is simply business. The syndicate was prepared to offer a very generous buyout package for your territory. Shut your mouth, Declan growled, stepping into Sterling's personal space. The syndicate's CEO flinched backward, genuine fear crossing his face for the first time in probably decades. Thornridge Pack reclaims this land tonight. Every acre your organization stole from murdered wolves. Your syndicate is done in Montana, done in the entire Northern Rockies. The only question is whether you walk out of here in handcuffs or in body bags. Griffin's hand tightened fractionally on Morgana's throat. She made a choking sound, her perfectly manicured fingers scrabbling at his wrist. Griffin, darling, please, she gasped. I can explain, it's not what it looks like. He dropped her. She collapsed to the floor, gasping, her hands going to her bruised throat. Griffin looked down at her with an expression of such profound disgust that she shrank back. Then he placed his boot on her chest directly over where the Luna mark would be the symbol of her position as his mate, as second in the pack, as someone trusted with power and responsibility. By my blood, Griffin intoned, and this time the ancient words carried far more weight than when he had spoken them to Exile Sutton. This was judgment from a broken man who had finally seen the truth. By my bone, by the power vested in me as Alpha King of Stonehaven, I strip you of your title. I strip you of your pack. He paused, letting the words sink in. You are rogue. Morgana's scream was inhuman. The Luna bond tearing away was different from a regular pack bond. It carried status power, the combined strength of the Alpha's authority. Ripping it out was like tearing away a load-bearing wall. She convulsed on the floor, her back arching, her fingers clawing at the polished wood as the Luna mark on her chest began to burn. The elegant tattoo, a wolf howling at a crescent moon, blistered and blackened smoke rising from her skin. She writhed, shrieking, as the magical connection severed itself in a way that left scars deeper than flesh. When it was over, Morgana lay gasping on the floor. The ruin of her mark weeping clear fluid, her carefully constructed world destroyed as thoroughly as she had tried to destroy Stonehaven. Vaughn, Griffin said, his voice empty of everything except exhausted command. Get the survivors up here. Turn on the medical bays in the eastern wing. They have independent power. Critical cases first. Move. Vaughn saluted, actually saluted, and disappeared back down the hole. Griffin turned to face Sutton and Declan, the woman who had tried to save his pack and the ghost of his father's sins. For a long moment, he just looked at them, his steel-gray eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and unshed tears. Sutton, he said quietly, I was blind. My arrogance killed 241 people. I struck you, exiled you, destroyed you for telling me the truth. He took a shaking breath. I'm asking, begging you to take the Stonehaven mark again. Be my beta. Help me rebuild this pack the right way. Vaughn has already agreed to step down. Please. Sutton looked at him for a long moment. She saw the genuine regret in his eyes, the broken honesty of a man who had lost everything and finally understood what he'd thrown away. She looked around the bunker at the wolves beginning to filter up through the breach, traumatized, grieving, but alive. She had saved them. She had proven herself right in the most terrible way possible. But the bond to Stonehaven was dead. The fire that had once burned in her chest for this pack had been extinguished the moment Griffin's hand had struck her face in front of everyone she'd served. She looked at Declan, the scarred alpha who had risked everything, who had torn open 24-year-old wounds, who had faced his father's killers to help her save people he had every reason to hate. They were both broken. Both betrayed by alphas who had chosen empire over pack. Both survivors who had learned that sometimes the only way forward was to burn everything down and start over. She turned back to Griffin. No. Griffin's face crumpled, but he nodded slowly. Then what will you do? Sutton walked across the room to stand shoulder to shoulder with Declan Ashford. Declan's ancestors owned this land 150 years before yours. We're establishing new boundaries. Her voice was steady, implacable. Stonehaven can stay in this bunker until the Wendigo Winter passes. You have my word, we won't leave you to die. But when the ice thaws this compound, the deep wilderness and the deadlands belong to Thornridge restored. Declan looked down at her and something in his face shifted. A slow, genuine smile broke through 24 years of hardened bitterness, the first real warmth she'd seen from him. He placed his hand on the small of her back, not possessive, not controlling, just a gesture of partnership, protection, and something that felt dangerously like hope. Griffin closed his eyes. He'd lost his territory, lost 241 pack members, lost his pride. And he just handed his most valuable asset directly to the son of the pack his father had destroyed. Understood, he whispered. Sutton looked at Morgana and Sterling Voss. Strip their coats. Morgana's eyes went wide with terror. What? No, Sutton, please, you can't. You sentenced me to the Deadlands, Sutton said, her voice cold as the winter outside. You framed me, destroyed me, left me to die slowly in the cold. But I'm more merciful than you, Morgana. Vaughn and two other enforcers stripped the fur coats and tactical gear from Morgana Sterling and the syndicate executives, leaving them in their thin designer clothes. Upper levels, Sutton commanded. Ambient temperature is currently minus 12 degrees Fahrenheit. There are some tapestries up there, some broken furniture you can burn. If you huddle together, and if you're very, very lucky, you might survive until federal marshals can get through the roads to arrest you. Morgana's composure finally shattered completely. She sobbed, clawing at the floor as the enforcers dragged her toward the stairs. Griffin, don't let her do this, please. Griffin turned his back and walked toward the medical bay where his wounded pack waited. Sutton watched them disappear into the frozen upper levels. Then she lowered the Remington, and the adrenaline that had been keeping her upright for the past 16 hours finally drained away. She swayed, and Declan caught her wrapping a heavy blanket around her shoulders. You did good, Pierce, he said, his voice a rumble of comfort in her ear. Sutton leaned into his warmth and watched the Stonehaven survivors huddle together in the bunker's safety. For a moment, the bunker was silent, except for the sound of wolves breathing. Sutton sat down on the floor, her legs finally giving out, the shotgun clattering beside her. Declan lowered himself next to her, both of them too exhausted to stand. Around them, Stonehaven wolves were discovering what warmth felt like again. A pup actually laughed for the first time in days. Someone started crying not from grief, but from relief. The sound rippled through the room like a wave. "We did it," Declan said quietly. "We saved who we could," Sutton corrected. "That's more than most people ever do." Sutton looked at the raw scar on her chest where the Stonehaven mark had been. It would never fully heal. But maybe that was okay. Maybe some scars were meant to be carried. "Come on," she said, pulling herself to her feet. "We have work to do." Declan smiled and followed her. The federal marshals arrived 3 days after the Wendigo Winter broke. They found Morgana Drake and Sterling Voss in the upper levels of Stonehaven headquarters, huddled around the embers of a broken chair, barely alive. The syndicate executives hadn't made it. By then, Sutton had already given her testimony. The encrypted communications, the sabotage evidence, the financial records showing $20 million transferred from Obsidian Syndicate accounts to Morgana's offshore holdings. The charges were read in a federal courtroom in Missoula 2 months later. Conspiracy, sabotage, 241 counts of negligent homicide. The jury deliberated for 90 minutes. Guilty on all counts. Sutton didn't attend the sentencing. She was busy helping Vivian Caldwell bury her daughter. They held the funeral on the first day of true spring when the snow finally melted enough to break ground. 89 graves on a hillside overlooking what would become Thorn Ridge restored. Elder Thaddeus was buried with the historical scrolls he'd died protecting. Ember Caldwell was laid to rest with a collection of pressed butterflies that Ryland had made for his sister. Vivian stood at the grave for a long time after everyone else had left. Sutton stood with her, saying nothing, just being present. "She loved you," Vivian finally whispered. "Called you Aunt Sutton. Wanted to be a tracker like you when she grew up." "I know," Sutton said quietly. "I should have spoken up. At the tribunal. I should have." "You were protecting your family the best way you knew how," Sutton said. "I understand that now." Vivian turned to look at her, tears streaming. "Can you forgive us?" Sutton thought about that for a moment. "I'm working on it," she said. "Ask me again in a year." Dashiell survived the amputations. Declan designed custom prosthetics for him, lightweight, adaptive, better than flesh for certain types of terrain. Within 4 months, the kid was back in the wilderness, learning to track all over again. He was one of the first Stonehaven wolves to formally request transfer to Thornridge Restored. "I want to learn from someone who was right," he told Sutton when he made his petition. "Not someone who got lucky." She accepted him that same day. 6 months later, under a sky that had finally remembered how to be blue, Sutton Pierce stood on a ridge overlooking the territory that was now called Thornridge Restored. The rebuilt compound was a hybrid of old and new Declan's ancestors' original stonework architecture combined with modern sustainable technology. Solar panels covered the southern slopes. Geothermal heating kept every building warm. The pack had learned from the Wendigo Winter. They would never be caught unprepared again. 135 wolves now called this place home. 55 of them were former Stonehaven wolves who had chosen to follow Sutton and Declan rather than stay with Griffin. 45 were rogues who had heard about the pack that valued competence over politics, preparation over profit. 35 were Thornridge descendants that Declan had spent months tracking down and bringing home. No more corporate facade, no more Fortune 500 pretense. Just wolves who knew the price of arrogance and the value of listening to the people who understood the land. Sutton felt Declan's presence before he spoke, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder. "Radio call just came in," he said. "Syndicate activity 200 miles north. Glacier Station is requesting our best tracker." Sutton smiled and placed her hand over the new mark on her chest, a thornbird, in flight over mountain peaks, the symbol of Thornridge Restored. Not given by an alpha's command, but chosen freely, earned through blood and ice and the refusal to abandon people even when they had abandoned her. "Tell them we're on our way," she said. The work was never done. But now she faced it with a partner who understood that survival meant preparation, that leadership meant listening, and that the frost had a way of proving who was right when everyone else was too arrogant to see the storm coming. In the valley below, Griffin Lowell's diminished pack of 107 wolves maintained their reduced territory under federal oversight. Every quarter they paid tribute to Thornridge restored food supplies, and the quiet acknowledgement that some lessons could only be learned through loss. The Wendigo Winter had come and gone. The frost had proven Sutton right in the most terrible way imaginable. But she had survived, and she had saved who she could. And in the end, that was enough.